All right, so I just basically have this simple template, an index HTML page. I have a CSS file, and then I have a JavaScript file, which will handle all of the scripts for us. So you don't really need anything to start off with, because I'm basically gonna build this from scratch. Okay. So I just have this dummy text in there so that we have something to show you there. And so you can put the modal anywhere you want. I'm just going to put it at the top here. And so I'll create a div with the ID of modal. And then inside of that, I'm going to have the content. So I'll just say modal content. And then I will have the header. And then I'll have the body. And then lastly, the footer. So I'm going to add a span with this symbol, which is the close button that we're going to have. And so I'll add a class of close button to it. And then below that, I'll have an h2 tag that says modal title. And then in the body, I'll just enter some dummy data here. And in the footer, I'll have two buttons. One that says cancel, and then one that says save changes. And then I'll just add some classes to these. One will be the default button for this, and then the other one, I'll do primary. Okay, so I'll hit save on that so you can see what we have so far. And so this is basically the modal. So this outer div here, the one that says ID modal, this represents the entire screen because basically a modal is the entire screen. This portion you see here is really just a smaller part of it. And then of course the header is this part here to include the close button, then the body, and then the footer here. So now that I have the modal created, I can start styling it. This is basically all you need. So first, here in the style.css file I have linked up, I'm going to add a Google font to this so that it looks a little better. And then I will apply it. This asterisk basically means that it's going to apply it to every element in the document. So I'll do font family, use this one, and sans serif. And then I'm going to set my margins to 0 and padding to 0 because some things have padding by default. So you see how everything kind of just squishes together. And that gives me more control over setting the padding and margins for each individual items. So I'll start off with the main modal ID, which is this one. So the outer div. And for starters, I'm going to give it a background color of, say, aqua. So right now, it's only highlighting this portion because basically it's going to extend as far as the content, right? So since our content stops here, that's where the background stops. But we want it to fill up the entire page. So for that, we'll give it a fixed position, which basically means it'll be in the same position at all times, regardless of what device you're using. And then I'll give it a z index of 1 because I want it to be on top of all other content. And then left 0 and then top 0. And that basically just positions it for us in the top left corner of the page. And then we want the height to extend 100 viewport height, and that basically just the entire screen height. Okay, and so that'll basically adjust to any device that you're using. So if you open your Chrome developer tools and you click this little mobile icon here, you can select different types of mobile devices, and you'll see no matter the size, it does fill up the page. And then for width, I'll just set it to 100% width. Now I'm going to set this display to flex. And basically what that does is it allows us to position these items anywhere that we want. And so where I want it is dead center of the page. So for that, you need vertical and horizontal alignment. So you do justify content center and then align items center for the vertical. So you'll see now we have it dead in the center. Now this background was just kind of to show you what it's filling up, but we don't actually want that background. I'll use a transparent color, so I'll use an RGBA value, and then I'll set the transparency to 0.5. So now you see it's sort of like a dim color, which you'll see that sometimes in a lot of modals. So next we can go ahead and start styling the main content of the modal, which is just this area here. So I'll do modal content. I'm going to change the background color, and I'm just going to set it to like a white. Okay. Then I'm going to add a border to it of 1 pixel solid black. Now, when this modal initially loads, I want it to have some sort of effect. Modals usually will slide from the top, or they'll have some kind of transition effect. So I'm basically going to add my own custom effect here. And you do that with an animation. Well, there's a few ways to do it, but this is one of them. First, you name the animation wherever you want. I'll name it open. And then for how long you want that to that effect to appear, or basically to transition, right? So you want it over 1 second duration. Should be duration, not direction. And then right below it, what you do is you create that animation with this annotation keyframes. And right here, you name it whatever you named it up here. And one way we can do this is we can set the transparency, start off at 0, and then change it to 1, which basically just exactly what it's at now. And then we do that over the period of 1 second, so this is what it'll look like. You kind of see if you refresh the page, it slowly fades in. So it's like a fade-in effect, basically. Now that that's done, I want to add padding to all of these items here. So I'll just do modal body, modal header, and then modal footer, and I'll add padding of 20 pixels. Now as you're doing this, you basically want to look at it on some mobile device here and make sure that it still looks as good as it does on desktop. Okay, now I'm going to add some borders to these. So I'll do modal header, add a border to the bottom, and it's basically going to be a light black border. So I'll do RGBA 0, 0, 0. Okay, and there is our border. So kind of like light gray. And I basically want to do the same thing above the footer. And basically what this is doing is just kind of creating sections. Instead of bottom though, it'll be top. So see how it kind of like divides our sections there. So it's really kind of like a divider. And then lastly, I want these buttons to be on the right side. So I'm going to add text align right here. All right, and you'll see those buttons move over. Then I'm going to lastly style this close button here. If you remember, the class I gave it was close button. So you can just do close button, and I'll give it a color of white, kind of like a dim white. And then I'm going to float it to the right, so to move to the right there. And then I'm going to make it bigger. I'll say 30 pixels. Okay. Now, if you notice, if you hover over it, nothing happens, and we want it to look like a button. So you can add close button hover, and then style the hover effect, which will just make it black. And then we'll change the cursor to a pointer as well, so that it looks like it's something that you can click. So you see how that looks a little better. So next I'll style these two buttons. So I'll add some general style to all the buttons. One will be padding of 20 pixels. You see there, it looks a little better. And then I don't want them to be so square, so I'll add a border radius. Whoops. I'll say 0.25 EM, and you'll see it's not so square now. But because of the fact that it has its own built-in border, and they're going to look blocky, so what you can do is just say border 1 pixel solid transparent. Okay, so they don't look so blocky. And then I also want to make the fonts bigger on the buttons, so I'll say 1 EM. Okay, so again, make sure you look at it on mobile. Looks fine. Although I don't want this modal to stretch out to the edges like that. So I'm going to change the width in a minute here. But first I want to change these buttons. If you look, you hover over them, nothing happens. So we kind of just want to do the same thing that we did up here. So we'll do button hover, cursor, pointer. So you see now when you hover, it looks a little better. And if you look back at the buttons that we have 2 classes, BTN default and BTN primary. So I'll start off with BTN default, and I'm going to make the color different. I'm going to do 292 B2C. And then I'm going to change the background to be a sort of light. I'll do white, and then I'll make the border. Oops. Okay, and so you'll see there, we can still see the border, and that'll just be our default. Now we also want to add some hover to it, so I'll do button default hover. I'll just change the background color. And I'll basically do that same thing for the border. Okay, this is what it looks like. All right, so we got a pretty decent button there. And then I'll basically grab this and do the same thing for the primary. Except I'll just change these values. The color for primary is just going to be white, and then like a blue. And then for hover, we'll just do a darker blue. So okay, all right, and so we have some pretty decent looking buttons. So like I was saying before, now I want to adjust this width. I don't want this to stretch out like that. So I'm going to use something called media queries. And basically what that does is instead of having one static width at all times, I'll set the width based on whatever device the person is using. So if they're using say a device that's bigger than 855 pixels, then what I'll do is I'll set the model content. I'll set the width to 600 pixels. And then I'll have another one down here that's going to say max width of 854 pixels. And I'll just set the width to a percentage so that it will be responsive. All right. So basically, for the smaller devices, it'll have this 80%. So basically, no matter what device you have, it'll just automatically calculate that. And then if you have desktop or over 855 pixels, then we'll have this set width here. So kind of stretch that out and see that work. You can also click up here in Google Chrome responsive. You can see the exact measurements here of when those changes go into effect. Okay, and you can kind of see how it snaps like that. That's the media query taking effect. Okay. So that pretty much takes care of all the styling. Now I just want to add some JavaScript to this so that we can call this whenever we need it. So I'm going to add a button to the main document. I'll say right here. Okay, I'll make this of class btn primary. I'll just say open modal. So I'm going to add an event handler to this, and it'll be on click. So basically on click, we'll run this function here. And I'm actually going to add that everywhere that I want the function to call. You know, you could do something like add different functions for each button, but I'm just going to add the same function for all buttons, just an example. So you want to add this to the Save Changes button, the Cancel button, and then the span up here. Basically what that'll do is anytime those keys are pressed, it'll call the toggle modal function, which we haven't created yet, but I'm about to. So you want to go over to your JavaScript file and create that function, which was toggle modal. And for right now, I'm just going to say test, just because I want to make sure that this works. So, all right, and then you'll see the this function gets called every time you press these buttons. If this doesn't work for you, keep in mind that you may have to ensure that your script is loading before the rest of your code. So for example, here in my HTML, I have my script up here. So this function is already loaded before it gets here. In some cases, if you define the function afterwards, then these methods will not work. Okay. So if you are having issues, just move your script up here and that should work for you. So I want to point out how our modal here has an ID of modal. And back in the CSS file, we set the display to flex. Well, I'm going to set that to none for right now. And so what this function is going to do is going to set that back to flex. So I'm going to create a method here that says document.getElementById modal, which is our ID, style.display equals. And so basically we're going to do a conditional assignment here. So we'll basically say if document getElementById .style.display doesn't equal flex, then we will set it to flex, else we'll set it to none. Basically what that does is it allows us to toggle back and forth between flex and none. So right here what it does is it checks to see if this equals flex. If it doesn't, if it does, or I'm sorry, if it doesn't, then it'll assign it to flex. If it does, then it won't. So this is basically kind of like a shorthand for if else. And I'm also going to add another function here for the save button. I'll just name it save, and just to show you what you can sort of do after this, I'll say save. Okay, so now if you hit this button, you should get the modal, and then if you hit any of the buttons, you'll get save. Well, save changes, you'll get saved, but if you hit, say, cancel, it'll close it. You can open it back up. All right, and that is your basic modal template.